Hello, good afternoon. My name is Jimena Perry. I am the project manager of the Explorers of the International Federation for Public History. Welcome to our monthly event. Today we are in for a treat. We have 10 students from East Carolina University from diverse majors. I had the privilege of being their instructor this semester in a class called Introduction to Oral History. We had very interesting and engaging discussions, so we decided that we could share this with the public. So I'm very happy. This is like a very dear event to me. So good luck and thank you for accepting the invitation. This is gonna work in the following way. Since there's 10 of us, it will be too boring for the audience for me to introduce each one of you. So I was gonna ask you to please, when you start talking, introduce yourself, say your name and your major. And then we will answer one question first, and then we go to another question, and then we will open for the audience if they have any questions. I would like to ask the people in the audience to keep your mics muted the whole time. Use the chat if you want to make any kind of comment or question. And after the presenters answer the two questions, we will open for Q&A, but again, write them and I will read them for them. Okay, if you have any kind of comment meanwhile or something, just use the chat. I will be the one in charge to make sure everybody gets the questions if you want to address a particular person and that. So if there's nothing else, we can start. So as I mentioned before, besides of being the project manager for the Federation, I am also a teaching instructor professor at East Carolina University from the Department of History. And this semester, I taught for the first time at East Carolina a class about oral history. It was very interesting. I learned a lot. And I had a very, very interesting group. We were very, it was very diverse, and they were very engaged, and also they had a lot of opinions on many things, which was very interesting and also challenging for me. So the first question I would like us for you to discuss is like the topic we discussed almost the whole semester about the oral history versus written history. What's your opinion on that? Do you have any pros, cons? Do you think there's a balance? Now, you have the floor.
This is Jeff McLeod. I'm a graduate student, history major, and my opinion is oral history helps round out the traditional history point of view, just looking at things from a primary and secondary source. Oral history can add to when we study something, we research an issue. It can, when we interview someone, it can bring tone and volume to really know what a person is saying, as opposed to if someone is written something, we have to guess at their tone and their dialogue. So oral history can round out traditional history. It can be more subjugated. Interpretation can be involved with oral history, but it gives us more a fuller view of history if we can combine both sources, both ways of doing things. So that's my viewpoint that I've walked away from with studying oral history, is that it can really complement, it can really complete a historical analysis of something. It can add more to it, as opposed to if we only use traditional history, where we may still be lacking. It can give us a more full, well-rounded point of view, understanding.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Hi, I'm Jill Schuler. I'm in the Maritime Studies program. And I agree with what Jeffrey's saying, but I also like to take it a step further than that and argue that I think oral histories, in addition to being supplementary, can also be valuable as standalone products of history, especially in sort of capturing life histories and the everyday lives of people. It provides with a much more intimate and I would argue actually accurate glimpse of those people's lives because there isn't as many levels of interpretation. It's a recording, and so you're hearing those people speaking and you're hearing what they're saying, and it's just up to you to interpret as opposed to written documents where they may gather these histories and then write them down and then their interpretation, then you're interpreting their interpretation. And so I think that oral histories have a value separate from written histories as well.
Thank you, Jill.
Hi, I'm gonna go. Sorry, Avery.
Oh.
I'm Murdy. I'm a sociology grad student here at ECU, and I think pretty much all of us are going to say similar things to Jeffrey. I think that's a pretty group dynamic, but maybe we can all add different facets to it. So going along the same lines, I was thinking about this kind of like in a reverse engineering way. And I often, when I talk to like different people about different statistics, they'll come up with a story about somebody who goes against those statistics, which I think is important because there are, you know, statistics are an average, not, they don't tell the complete story. And so I think oral history specifically, with some of these more like complicated statistical issues can help, using Jeff's words, round out the picture, but also give people specific examples that don't go along the same lines as what they imagine. So that's my viewpoint. Thank you.
Thank you, Murdy.
I'm gonna go if that's okay with everyone.
Go.
Hi, I'm Avery. I am also a student in the graduate program sociology. And no surprise, I agree with what everyone else has said. I just kind of wanted to add that I think one of the values that oral history brings that written history maybe doesn't so much is how palatable it is to the general public, and it makes history a bit more relatable for people who aren't academics. Written history obviously has a ton of value, but I think on some level it may have a bit more value to academics. So making or showing the personal side of these historical events or time periods, I think has a lot of value.
Thank you, Avery.
Hi, this is Jonathan Willett. I'm a master's student in the history program, and I mean, again, everyone's saying great things that go right in lockstep with the class, but what I sort of started thinking about last night in regards to this is it sort of, oral history kind of reminds me of more of like where history sort of was birthed in the Western world back in Greece, with Herodotus going around and collecting a bunch of stories that created his histories. And so for me, it's maybe a more pure form of history and the type of history that a lot of us grew up wanting to kind of practice. And then when you get into the history program, you find sort of the theoretical based history as opposed to just recording. And so that was a distinction for me, but I think they both have a lot of value, just because, I mean, they complement each other very well. I think primary source versus historiography.
Jonathan.
I'll go next. Hi, my name is Tiffany Moore. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Sociology. I agree with everyone else. I am for the use of oral sources. In my opinion, oral sources add a value that cannot be obtained from using written sources. Oral sources actually allow us to experience things that we're reading about or learning about from the perspective of the people who are actually there. It adds atmosphere and context so that we are actually aware of how these things affected these people, how they reacted to them, the social climate, the political climate. It gives us a lot more background information than actually just reading a written source.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Oh, you go ahead, Miranda.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Yes, my name is Miranda Lee. I am a geography student, and I have an emphasis on feminist geography and leisure studies, and therefore that kind of plays a role in how I view oral history. Because within my department, there's this big academic divide that's also present in many other disciplines, and it's the positivist and subjective divide. And oral history is challenging these traditional notions that research, in order to be valid and to be scientific, it has to be objective. And what I've really learned about oral history is how, although it is subjective, it's still so valuable, and it can still be used to really just broaden our understanding of certain topics. So.
Thank you, Miranda.
Yeah, so much along the same lines. Sorry, I'm Lydia. I'm in the Maritime Studies graduate program. But much along the same lines that everyone else has said, that oral history opens quite a few more doors than written history. Not that written history is bad. It primary sources, journals, letters, diaries offer a lot of great information. But conducting interviews and talking to people face to face just offers another level of interaction, and seeing people's facial expressions and hearing the emotions in their voices just really adds to what can be learned. So that's why I think oral history kind of stands above written history.
Thank you, Lydia.
Hi, my name is Garrett. I'm a grad student in the Department of History. Oral sources versus written sources to me actually fall into the same pitfalls of the problems that people may have with written sources, where we're aware that there's an author presenting this information to us in some form or fashion, whether it could be something explicitly written for a journal, it could be journalistic in its narrative. Oral sources, to me, fall into the same, or they encounter the same problems. However, the problems are just more visualized. Most times, interviews that would be used for oral sources, generally speaking, are filtered and edited to particularly portray that interview or that subject matter in a way that either fits or disagrees with a specific argument, either one that the author itself is making or trying to disagree with. I think that the advantages to oral sources, though, are quite different than written sources, and I would agree with Jeffrey, where he said that they can both complement each other. I think finding a balance and utilizing the correct methodology is much more important than determining or just trying to find a preference for a specific source. I wouldn't necessarily like to say that oral sources have less value. I think they have equal. They just certainly have their own place and need to be carefully considered when proposing research and then creating these interviews.
Thank you, Garrett.
Hi, my name is Chai Bang. I'm 22 years old. I'm a double major in history and political science. So the one thing that I really like about oral history versus written sources is that some sources out there don't have a written language. So that's where oral history really comes in and is a game changer when you're trying to find sources. So that's, for me, one of the really big things about oral history, because not everybody is able to write down this stuff compared to languages that have been created since forever ago.
Thank you, Chai. Yes, I agree, of course, with all of the things you have said. And I would add that one of the things I personally like about oral history is its multidisciplinary character. It's about, we have also talked about this many times during the semester. It's about the question you want to ask. You can approach your research question from many perspectives. And oral history is just like a skill, something you learn to answer that question. So you can be a geographer, a business major, an archaeologist, an historian. That also, oral history also gives you like the tools to get in conversation with other fields. And I think that's a very important thing of oral history, that It opens your mind, makes you more flexible, etc. So thank you. Now, I would like you all from your own field, from your own perspective, tell me how would you apply oral history to your own research? You can use the same order we did before if that's easier for you.
This is Jeff McLeod again. A graduate major in history. But one thing I can already use oral history sources because I'm already in a profession in the Department of Health and Human Services, and as one of the classmates pointed out in a previous class, there isn't really a lot of oral history being done on mental health and mental illness right now. So I can go ahead and approach my superiors at the department and start to put those let's get some more things out there on history on mental, so individuals can understand mental health and mental illness. But as a graduate major in history, and my thesis being how the 19th World War I affected the civil rights movement here in the United States. Many people feel like the civil rights movement started in the 1960s. But I can start to use podcasts and other things to start to show that really it was World War I that really was the instigator of the civil rights movement, and how the war affected how African Americans started to see that they could take control and did not have to give over to white supremacy, that they could start to make efforts to gain their civil rights. So that's how I see it, using it in my own research as a history major, of using start to telling the story of the civil rights movement through podcasts and webcasts in that way.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
I can go. This is Murdy. So my research is on Confederate statue removal in Eastern North Carolina. And one of the reasons I got into this project in the first place is because of last summer, when they voted to remove the Confederate statue at the Pitt County Courthouse here in Eastern North Carolina. And so when I was driving by, I kept checking to see when it was going to be done. And then they ended up doing most of it at like midnight, so people wouldn't be viewing. But at one point I went and there was workers working on it. And I just was like so curious, as if they had like noticed it before, and then if they had like what their thoughts were to its removal. And I think that oral history, like in this way, could be really important when talking about a sensitive subject like Confederate monument removal, because it is polarizing. And so I really think it'd be interesting for my research, like currently, but also for these records to exist for future generations to know that this wasn't an easy thing, and it was highly controversial. Thank you.
Thank you, Murdy.
So this isn't so much applying it to research, but it is applying it. I have a strong interest in political and social activism. And I think that oral history actually could be a really great mechanism to influence policy change. It's easiest to change hearts and minds when you appeal to people's emotions. And if you can tell real life stories about how marginalized communities are affected by different policies or issues, I think you have a much better chance of convincing people to come over to your side, for lack of a better way to say it. So I think that outside of research, it actually could serve as a really positive means to change policy and make a difference with some of the many social issues that we face in our world today.
Thank you, Avery.
Yes, so my research is surrounding solo female travelers, and within scholarship, there is not a lot of articles and publishings talking about solo female travelers. So when there is this new kind of topic that's not been heavily discussed before, oral history can be super useful because you can go and talk to the people who say are older generation female travelers, and then you could hear their stories of how they have experienced a change in tourism and leisure, and then you could compare them to solo female travelers of today or younger generations, and then you could have this comparison that you otherwise wouldn't just find in written documents when you're looking through journals or whatever.
Thank you, Miranda.
I would like to agree with something that Avery said. As a sociology major, typically we use written sources. They're a lot of times outdated, but we know sociology and such disciplines as that and political science actually affect a lot of social policy. In these cases, when we study the public, we do not add the personal touch to it. We talk about people and situations as if they're unreal, as if it's just a word on the paper. Adding oral sources to sociology and political science actually personalizes it. So when policies are being created and implemented, it can actually be more valuable as far as the policymakers looking at people as if they're real people, and maybe add a little compassion to those disciplines as opposed to just simply an overview of this is a problem for a particular group, but we're very separated from those people.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I was just gonna talk about oral history in my own research. It's actually going to be a very large part of my thesis, which is I'm focusing on a dugout canoe that was found in southern North Carolina, and it dates back about 650 years. It was rediscovered in 2018, and then in 2019, it was adopted back into a Native American tribe that is believed to be the descendants of the people who made it. And so part of my research is that I'm planning to meet with tribal members and interview them about what having the canoe in their tribe again means to them and how it helps them connect with their past and their ancestors and just the significance that it holds to them. So yeah, that's just how I'm using it in my research going forward. So.
Thank you, Lydia.
All right, I'm sorry. This is Jonathan again. And in my research, what I'm looking at is I study food history. And so when looking at some of the traditional American dishes, I'm focusing on one out of Kentucky for my thesis. But when you're taking a look at the sort of commodification of fast food and big farm and all of that stuff, we're losing a lot of sort of Americans' traditional recipes that were brought by immigrants, that were created by blending cultures and things like that in favor of a more homogenized diet. I mean, anybody driving down any interstate can see that it's the same selection at every exit. And so my hope is that by actually going up there this summer, hopefully, and interviewing people that still produce the dish for restaurants, as well as local historians and local people, that I'm going to be able to have a deeper understanding of when the dish started to disappear from restaurants and what was the importance to that particular region for that particular dish, because there's not a lot written about it. So oral history becomes really, really important in that regard.
Thank you, Jonathan.
My research is on 18th century merchant vessels, and so there's a limited amount that I can use oral histories for that. But I do want to echo what Avery and Tiffany were both saying And I think it's quite interesting because they're coming at it from a sociological perspective. And so they see the value that oral histories can have in making sort of political progressive change. And for me, with my history background, and I also have a background in museums, I'm just excited about the prospects of oral history and making progressive changes within history itself. It presents sort of this remedy to the fact that there's so many marginalized communities that haven't been represented in the written record. And there's no other way for us to obtain those stories other than to conduct these oral histories. And so I think, especially with the way technology is expanding and the way that oral history sort of can find a place within that and become more accessible, it's exciting to see what the future of oral history holds.
Thank you, Jillian.
Hi, this is Chaigan. So I'm still an undergraduate student and I don't have a research, but if I was to research something, I'll definitely try to do it on the Hmong culture. So I'm Hmong. Not a lot of people know that. And how I would use oral history to help out Hmong culture is because there was no written language for us until I think like 1950. So that's not a lot of time for us to write down a lot of history. And Hmong people have been dating back since way back then, since before Chinese people even moved into China. So a lot of the things that I would love to do is to show like the new generation, like where we come from, because a lot of the people nowadays don't even know the language no more. And that's like kind of upsetting for me. They don't know like the tales, like where we come from. So that's the one thing that I would like to focus on, to use oral history.
Thank you, Chai.
Yeah, this is Garrett. I'm looking to study Atlantic world history in a colonial era, so anywhere from 1400 to about 1800 or so, towards the end of slavery being legal at the time. So one thing I would maybe use oral history for, it's difficult because those people are no longer around, and I can only reference texts or experts who have also written texts. However, there are still people that have been, through oral tradition, been told the stories of their ancestors, be it through slaveholding, be it through people affected still in Africa today, people in South America, because I'm looking at the 4 different continents mainly involved, so North America, South America, Europe, and Africa. I would like to go into an oral tradition research about those different groups and their different perspectives, and how they can interpret today what their ancestors, or being generations down, how they interpret the actions of the people of their own bloodline. I think that's something that a lot of we've talked about in oral history may not necessarily reference. We try to use it more for social, as a skill for social change, but we could also look at it as a skill to understand an individualized perspective about things that have happened in the past and how they affect the individual today. So how did those things that happen change us now, versus arming those things and using these modern contexts to create a future? I think it's a little bit of a different direction to go in, but I think it's could be equally valid if done correctly.
Yes, thank you, Garrett. I'm going to take the opportunity also to tell you how I use oral history in my own research. As I have told you before, I'm from South America, I'm from Colombia. I work on about how communities remember their violent pasts in the current Colombian conflict. I do that through museums, but for that I have to interview a lot of rural and marginal communities. And I also like to think that I am helping those people like to remember and to go through a grieving process and to give them voice, because generally speaking, but it's changing now, we always tell the stories of the people who won, or like of the victors, and we also need to well, tell the stories of regular people. So I think that also that's very important about oral history, which takes me to our next question, because we have time for another question. What are some of the limitations and ethic dilemmas you can see about oral history, if you find some?
There is a switch in narratives when you do interview people. So when you're like interviewing one person, they're going to have a different perspective of what they learned or what they saw compared to another person that witnessed the event as well. So it's very hard to bring two or more interviews together and try to piece it together as a historical fact.
Okay, thank you, Chai.
Yeah, I was just going along with that. I mean, you definitely need to be careful about using perspectives from different sides and angles as to not have the oral history aspect be biased, I guess. I guess you'd probably want it. I'm just thinking about what I was saying about with the statistics and having stories like personalize that. But yeah, I think you just want it even as much as possible in order to remain ethically ambiguous.
Yeah,
That's
thank you,
it.
Marty.
This is Garrett again. This is actually something I've been wondering about that for a majority of our class, and we've discussed oral history being an agent for social change. When you do put yourself out there in those possibly difficult perspectives and you're engaging in society with that, we have to remember that there are consequences for those things should there be events that happen because of particular social movements. I mean, we've seen it in the past with the Soviet Union. I mean, millions of people died because of the social change happening in their culture, in their time period, and it's because of they wanted to make a change from where they thought was a bad place. We have to remember that things can certainly be bad and can definitely justify the need for change, but we should also be aware of how we're using these perspectives when trying to initiate some sort of change in the future, because there will be consequences for anything you put action into.
Thank you, Garrett.
This is Jonathan again. One thing that I always sort of flash back to is the class where we were watching, we had to watch the video of the, I believe she was perhaps a British woman who was interviewing through an interpreter, the African man. And one of the main limitations there is if you are interested in studying something, pardon me, that is from a culture not your own, in a language not your own, sometimes, as we saw in that video, it can become problematic to kind of deal with that. And you also have to be really, really, really careful when it comes to limiting cultural bias, because that's something I think that we talked about quite a bit too, because, you know, even with the best of intentions, it's impossible to completely eliminate a bias in a culture you didn't grow up in. So that's another problematic issue as well.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Sorry, Lydia, we keep doing this to each other. But
Go for it. Go ahead.
Thank you. So just to kind of build off what Jonathan said, when specifically within geography, there's this insider-outsider ethical dilemma that I believe also can be, you know, applied within oral history. And it's basically where there's like this power structure between the researcher and the researched. And it's just showing how, especially within like communities that are marginalized, how if as a researcher, you are already in a privileged position to come in and extract information, and therefore you have to go about it really respectfully. But I do think the ethical dilemma in question with that is it just boils down to that power of how you are in a better position and therefore you are now being able to tell their stories, which is their stories, and you're just in this position where you can put it out there. So
thank you, Miranda.
Kind of feeding off of Jonathan and Miranda and keeping that sense of more neutrality in as the interviewer, you are absorbing what these people have experienced or what they're saying. And so if it's a difficult subject matter, like if they have polar opposite views from yourself, or if they've lived through something really traumatic that you're asking them about and it becomes very emotional, you have to kind of maintain that neutral or like you can't let it kind of take you over. So being able to control your own emotions and not impose them on the interviewee can be difficult as well. So yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lydia.
This is Jeff McLeod. To be able to, in a difficult interviewing situation, to be able to divorce yourself from your own emotions. We all have our personal viewpoints and our own feelings. And it is hard to separate, especially if you feel very strongly about something. But to temporarily suspend or divorce ourselves from our own emotions so that we just take a neutral or objective point of view and just listen to the person that we're interviewing and just step back from ourselves would be so important in this field to be able to do a good interview in a difficult situation.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
I think another. Oh, it's me echoing. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Another major ethical consideration, which I think expands beyond just sort of the production and our own interpretation, is also the safety and security of the people that we're interviewing. There's a really interesting terminology that we pulled from this class of highly politicized research settings. And it's sort of settings where there is a lot of information and history to be taken, but there are also places where there's still a lot of tumultuary and just uncertainty. And so the people that you're interviewing could still be in a dangerous situation. And I think that that's true for a lot of different oral histories because of the fact that they tend to focus on, especially if you're trying to facilitate social change, areas where there are still sort of highly politicized factors. And so in addition to making sure that you remain neutral and yet you're interpreting their story and being respectful of them in the interviewing process, you also have to think about the consequences of that interview being told, and likely that you are more aware of those consequences that they are when they tell it. And so being respectful of them and maintaining their anonymity and considering what kind of security position it puts them in is also a crucial ethical consideration.
Thank you, Jillian.
This will be stating the obvious on some level, I'm sure, but one of the largest limitations of oral history is you are completely reliant on another person. The success of your research depends solely on another person or people. And there are tons of complications that come along with that. Like it takes a lot of time and resources to do this kind of research and to conduct these interviews. And you may spend all of that time and sit down with someone that just isn't that willing to talk to you. And then your research can't be successful because you got no information out of it. And you also run into the issue of people, we're human beings. We don't always remember things accurately. You have to take this person's word, but their word may not really be accurate. And then that also affects the success of your research. So dealing with people is just difficult sometimes.
Thank you, Avery.
Another problem with doing oral history is dealing with the personal motivations of the interviewee. Sometimes they can twist stories or tell falsehoods or just, exaggerate a situation for their own personal motives. Say, for instance, they're trying to get some type of policy or the government to change their perspective on something. They may not give you the full truth behind what actually occurred or how its effects were on that society or that group of people. So you do have to be careful when selecting an interviewee because you want to make sure they don't have their own personal motives that would cause them to be untruthful.
Thank you, Tiffany. Everybody already answered this question? Yes? Okay, I would like to take a minute to see if we have any questions or comments from the audience. You can write them in the chat, please. Let's see if we have something. If we don't have anything, I have questions for you, of course. I have lots of questions for you. I think Miranda pointed out a very important topic is like the topic about like the power relationships when you go and also it's a little bit related with what Avery was saying. When you work with people, there's all kinds of things going on. But when you're the interviewer, sometimes you're in a position of power. How do you think we can make that less obvious? How can you think you can make your interviewees feel more comfortable with you?
You can try to. Oh, sorry. You go ahead.
Well, okay, I was just gonna say that we had discussed how you have it conduct it more like a conversation, the interview, and you can share a little bit more about yourself so that you're more relatable to the person that you're interviewing, and then it's less of a power dynamic, and it's more that you're just two people having a conversation, which kind of eliminates that imbalance. Go ahead, Garrett.
Yeah, I genuinely, I like that. It's a really good point, Lydia. I would also say to make accommodations, generally and maybe more directly. Put them in an environment that maybe they can choose. Maybe people, or they have particular interviewers that they would maybe prefer to speak with. If that's something that's possible, I would try to set that up. You want to be able to get the best information for the research possible. Now, that doesn't mean to accommodate to be able to just get anything that you can from them, because some of those things may be unrelated to your research, or maybe could invalidate the research question and even the reason why you're speaking to them in the first place. If they're just trying to make you spend more, because funding is also a thing we have to worry about for research, you can't have them ask too many things of you until you're running out of the resource to be able to properly conduct your research. So it's trying to find a balance between the individual and the research question, and how you want to go about getting that answered. Properly balancing accommodations, I think, can do that.
Thank you, Garrett.
Am I good? Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
My response to that question would be, I'm not sure that there is a way to remove your power. I feel like that's just an embedded piece of the puzzle. I think it's just more of something you need to be aware of and be respectful of, rather than try and say, oh, well, we aren't powerful because we're in this position. We are powerful in this position. Now, how are we going to use this position for good? And how are we going to be respectful about doing so? And it's all about being transparent, in my opinion, because like I said, I really don't know. I think given the relationship, the power dynamic is just inevitable. And I would be happy to hear if anyone else has any like contrasting views, but that's just my take on it.
Good. Thank you, Miranda.
I do think something as small as making contact with the person that you're going to be interviewing several times over whatever time frame it is, if it's a month or 2 months or whatever, that you're making contact with them and kind of developing somewhat of a rapport ahead of the interview. It's a lot easier, obviously, to sit down with someone that you feel like you know, even if you just know them a little bit, and have an open and frank conversation than it is to have an in-depth conversation about your life with someone that you've talked to once, and that was to set up an interview. So I think just making contact more than just the time that you set up the interview can be really helpful as well.
Thank you, Avery.
And to follow up on what Miranda said, meeting with the interviewee just maybe a few minutes before we start the interview, just having a friendly chat to, as this person to person. So that each, you feel comfortable with each other, especially the person you're being interviewed feels comfortable with you. You're just another person. You're just doing the interview. They can feel relaxed and more transparent. And so the power dynamic is not as great. I think that would also help in the power dynamic lessen that.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Miranda, if I might, I kind of have to disagree. Just because I think for all of us in this class, we're so focused on telling the stories of marginalized communities, and those inherently have the sort of power dynamic that is easily expressed when you do oral histories. But I think that if you're conducting oral history interviews with people that aren't a part of those communities, the same power dynamic does not exist. If I go and record an oral history of the President of the United States, I imagine I'll feel much more inferior than they do, and they're likely trained and prepared and feel that they have much more control in that situation. And so if I could, I kind of want to pose this question of like how do you maintain that sort of like how do you deal with a situation like that where you're not the one who really has the power in that situation, and how do you hold your own when you're conducting that type of interview? Because I don't think that it's always the same power structure.
Great, thank you, Julia. Miranda, before you answer that, can we hear from the other ones about the first question? But don't forget, Miranda.
This is Jonathan, and Jimena, I don't know if you've had any experience with this before, but one of the things I thought that might level out the playing field a little bit is sort of, I believe, as you've mentioned, sort of going to where they are rather than forcing them to come to you. And another thing that I kind of constantly think of, and maybe it's because I'm a food historian, but it's pretty hard to sort of share any type of meal with someone, you know, and I realize that might not be the best thing for recording to have people talk with their mouths full, but perhaps even, you know, sharing a meal or, you know, doing something that normalizes, you know, the situation might actually put the interview somewhat on the back burner so that you're able to have a less encumbered conversation where, you know, it's the focus might be on the interview, but you know you're doing something else as well, which could provide a distraction that kind of keeps you on the same level. But that's just a thought.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I also think the interview setting would be important. If you say, for instance, we're sitting in a small office where there's just a big table and it's just you and the interviewee, then that makes it a little bit uncomfortable. But if you were to choose a more relaxed setting where it doesn't seem as uptight, it's not as structured, you know, it's not, I'm just sitting here and I'm in this shaded room and I'm the only person here and they're just going to drill me with all these questions. If you could do it in a more relaxed setting, I think that would help to ease the power dynamic there as well.
Thank you, Tiffany. Okay, I like that question because I don't think it has like an only one answer. I think Miranda's right, and I think Jillian is right, and I think like everybody's right. I think the power dynamics are never going to be away completely, but I think there are ways to make them less. Let's say in museums we talk about co-creation, and we are talking more about participation, like making the others like part of the working group, if you want to. That, as Miranda says, may always not be like a total level up of the power, but it can help. It could be like a way of using your power for good, if you want, and not for actually exercising power over other group. But okay, Miranda, your rebuttal to Jill.
Well, I will first say, Jill, you made some excellent points because, like, with your example with the president, obviously he would have more social power than any of us would. However, we still get to take his words and apply it in our voice. Therefore, we have the power in that situation because we're taking whatever he says and applying it in our own publishings. Therefore, we have his words, but it's in our voice. We're putting things in our voice, and that's where the power lays, in my opinion. So,
any comments about Miranda's?
Yeah, I think that might be one of the faults of oral history then, to acknowledge the power dynamic problem and then in interpretation refute it. That may not necessarily be good for the history nor for the integrity of the interview. If you're going to basically break down the structure anyways, instead of just laying it out as a part of the history itself. I think maybe manipulating that situation is possibly a reason why people may be a little hesitant to jump into oral history or to accept it as a valid interpretation of history.
Thank you, Garrett. More comments for Miranda and Garrett about this? Okay, I'd like to remember the audience that they can jump in at any time in the chat. So going from that question, it's related, but can you really be objective? Can you really detach your emotions? Can you really do that? Let me know what you think.
I mean, we're all human
This is
beings.
Jeff McLeod. So I alluded to that earlier. I don't think totally no. You try. If you're really, especially if a person holds an opposing point of view or even a similar point of view, you can try the best and you can kind of, maybe come up to a point temporarily, but no, you cannot just totally suspend your own emotions and from a situation, and they can leak through, but you're trying to keep that down because you're trying to keep your focus on the person you're interviewing, not yourself. You're not trying to unduly influence them because then it takes away the objectivity of what they're saying. If they're being influenced by you, you want them to speak. You don't want as the person doing the interview to be influencing them. You want them to speak, not you. However, totally no. But can you at least do it up to a point temporarily? Yes. But the stronger you feel emotionally about a subject, the harder that's going to be. And in fact, if you feel, as I've often said, if you feel too strongly about something, it almost might be better to let someone else handle that interview because your own emotions are going to start to come through, and that's not what you want. You want the other person speaking, not yourself as the interviewer in that situation.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
I agree with Jeffrey. There are ways to mitigate how subjective you are being, but interviews are inherently subjective. I mean, based on our identities or in our brains or what create these questions that we start to ask these people. So already we have involvement in this process. So again, there are ways to try and remove yourself from it. But at its core, you're using your own brain and you're using your own position and in your reality to come up with these questions, and you're using your own interest to probably develop your research questions and your topics. And it's all subjective in my opinion.
Thank you, Miranda.
I would agree. I mean, everyone has their own backgrounds and perspectives and bring their own bias. And even if you try and limit that, you're still going to interpret the interview from your own side of things. And keeping that neutrality and eliminating bias is almost completely impossible, if not completely impossible. But just trying to keep it in mind that you're there as to listen and then to give this information as it was given to you is the most that any interviewer could do. So
thank you, Lydia.
I think Jonathan, I think what's really important is, and I believe we discussed this earlier in the semester, but if you have to kind of know where your limits are, and if you feel even a little bit like something is going to test you or push you to a point where you might feel uncomfortable, then my suggestion is basically, maybe that's not the right interview for you to do. Because I know for myself, if I was interviewing someone and I happened to notice that hanging on the wall behind them was some type of memorabilia to racism or oppression or something like that, and not even that they were speaking about that particular thing, but if I noticed that they had something like that hanging in their home, I would imagine that my attitude might shift, or if they said a certain thing, my attitude might shift, and I know that would probably show on my face, which would cause them to either get emotional and react negatively to the questions, or perhaps they'll start shaping their answer into what they think I want to hear, which would sort of damage the credibility there. But that's my 2 cents on it.
Thank you, Jonathan. I would like to make a pause because Grace Slater has a comment. I'm going to read it. kind of jumping off the idea of objectivity. Is it ultimately more important to get the interview, even if it might be a bad one, or remove yourself if you feel like there may be issues with objectivity that might interfere with the interview? And then comes, remember that question because you're going to answer, Grace, and then comes Deborah. The counselor who happens to be listening and is thrilled to hear such rich discussion around the concept of power dynamics. The detailed attention to this topic speaks to a high level of ethics among the students. There are always power dynamics. No one can ever be truly objective. You are all correct in your varied views about these dynamics. The awareness and mindfulness around this is what's key. However, the example of the president is most outlying, in quotes, one that sometimes an interviewer does not inherently have the power because they are creating the final product. In fact, there can be fear of repercussions. Great discussion, and I wish I didn't have to sign off. Thank you. But okay, so just answer to Grace about the objectivity that might interfere. Yeah, and that kind of goes with the question, how far would you go? Like we have discussed that already. Okay, Murray, go.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this previously in class, like everyone has their limits on what they're able to do and like what subjects they're able to talk about. Okay, maybe obviously not without bias because we live with bias every day, but you know, at least to be like professional. And so I think that if you feel like you need to remove yourself, then you need to do that. I don't think it's worth it to put yourself in a ethically ambiguous situation just to like finish an interview. And so I don't know exactly the answer. Like if you really need to get that interview and you're not able to do it, maybe you can get somebody else to do it. Maybe you need to find like a different subject. I'm not saying that someone should quit just because there's issues of objectivity, but you definitely shouldn't like put yourself in any like I said, ethically ambiguous situation, or you know, subject your interviewee to that discomfort. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Marty.
I think another piece, which I know it wasn't specifically mentioned, but is kind of built into what everybody else has said, that make a piece that makes objectivity difficult is generally you are interviewing someone for a subject that you are very interested in, that you care about. So you're already biased in that regard. And then the preconceived notions, because you likely have done research on this subject in the past, you're likely going to, even if you try not to, go into the interview with preconceived notions about what this person is going to say or the kind of message that they're going to convey to you, which I think makes objectivity hard. And to the question about how far would you go and how far would you push your own boundaries, my classmates have already heard me say this, but I personally, I would not be able to sit down and interview someone who had beliefs that threaten the lives of others, for lack of a better way to say it. I don't see the value in it. So again, there's an example of my struggles with objectivity, because I couldn't put my own emotions aside and do that.
Who else, please, wants to answer, Grace?
Yeah, I actually think it's a great question. I also think that kind of gets into the more journalistic aspect of oral history. If the point of doing some things with oral history is to create a narrative for social change, it's not too different than just a more research intensified version of journalism at times. So I would say getting the interview for oral history is likely very important. However, it may not be necessarily valuable to your peers of the same research focus. I don't know if this is something we've necessarily talked about before, but peer review being involved in oral history. I can't say that I remember us having a discussion about that, and it's something that this question really brings to mind. Not all research is very good research. I think we can all acknowledge that from any spectrum. Not everybody is great, but there are also some people that are very good, and they're likely people that are established in their field. So maybe having people that are established in your field reviewing some of your content can allow you to develop not necessarily a less objective way of going about that research, but maybe something that's more contributive rather than armed with personal opinions that maybe you want to change in the future or change the minds of others.
Garrett, yes, you're right. We didn't discuss that in class, but I think it's a very important point. I think peer review should be also a part of it. Thank you, and I'll have that in mind. So who else wants to answer, Grace? Okay, so I think personally, I agree with Avery. I think it's perfectly okay to remove yourselves from a situation that you know that you can handle. It's about knowing yourself and how far can you go. It's also being aware that you cannot force responses that you want to hear. If you go into an interview and you hear that things that you weren't expecting or things that you really, really don't want to tackle with, how would you react to that? How would you manage a situation like that? It's my question for you.
Can you repeat that?
If you go into an interview and everything comes out very unexpected and they respond to you, they answer you things that you aren't waiting, how would you manage that? What would you do?
I think you continue the research and you use that interview, whether you like what you got or not. I mean, there were plenty of times when I was taking stats that I really wanted the numbers to come out a certain way and the data to go the way that I'd expected it to go, but it didn't. And I think that, oral history should be no different. It is what it is, whether it was what you wanted, whether it supports your hypothesis or not, it's valid and you spent the time collecting it, so you should use it.
Yeah, I would agree with Avery. One thing about doing research is that even if the answer that you want is yes, but you get the answer no, that is still an important answer that needs to be documented and reported, and because it's still an answer that future researchers can use to base their research off of. And if it doesn't go the way you want, maybe you can interview someone else, or you can just ask more questions, or try and move on with it. But if it isn't going to go the way you want, then that's kind of just the way it is. So
thank you, Lydia.
And I agree with the previous two answers. In doing research, it sometimes is encouraged in research papers to bring out the opposing point of view. And we can document if someone has something totally different from what we're researching and has an opposite answer, that should be documented too. And that could be a very, as just pointed out, a very valuable piece to other researchers in the future. Because there's always two sides to an issue, or wouldn't be much research to it.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
I had a different interpretation of, oh, sorry, Jonathan.
You're right,
I had
go
a
ahead.
different interpretation of your question. I didn't think of it as sort of what their replies are not being in line with what you were hoping their replies would be. I kind of considered it more as they were getting off track from what you were wanting them to answer. And so I'm going to answer that question because I think it's very, very different response. And I think it's sort of one of the rare opportunities where having that power dynamic is kind of helpful, because it puts you in the position of, especially as the interviewer, of being like, okay, that's not the question that I wanted you to answer. I want you to answer this question. And I think it's a lot harder as an interviewee to kind of have that control over that. I think as an interviewer, you're allowed to kind of direct the questions more. And so that was my interpretation of what you're asking is during the interview process, how do you sort of deal with people that aren't really answering the questions that you want to be answered, as opposed to just answering them in ways that you didn't like the answer for. So that's just a different interpretation of that. And I think it really just relies on you having a commitment to what you are asking, and sort of not backing down when posing those questions respectfully.
Thank you, Jillian.
I kind of took the question differently, I guess, from everybody else as well. And I kind of took it as, at what point, what do you sort of do if you begin to feel not threatened, but uncomfortable with what the person is saying? And so my interpretation of it is, I have pretty thick skin. I mean, I can handle things to a certain point. And again, I'm not saying if you feel physically threatened or anything, but if you're there to talk to somebody about something that's maybe a little bit more bland, and all of a sudden you start getting these answers out of left field that morally you have a problem with, to me, there's a stopping point, because if they are taking it someplace different, and as well as, espousing some type of speech, that could be interpreted as hateful or anti something that doesn't really have anything to do with what you're talking about. I think for me, there's a point where I would just say, like, I'm really thankful for your time, and then just kind of bow out, but that was the way that I took the question. So Jillian, you weren't alone there.
Thank you, Jonathan. I have a question from the audience. First, Grace says, thank you all. I enjoyed the discussion. And there's a question from Maria Posada. She says, how does oral history relate to past events where you can't interview anyone? How would you answer that?
Well, I've been thinking about this, and so I don't like recorded oral history. How old is that? Like 100 years, I guess.
Let's say.
Maybe. But I was thinking of this project where they recorded oral histories of previously enslaved people that came over, like on the last slave ship, which I can't remember the name of it, but it was like in 1864, right before the end of the Civil War. Oh yeah, it was illegal. They came to Mobile, Alabama, and there's a free town there. Anyways, but people who were previously enslaved on that ship were interviewed in like the 19-teens or 20s, and there was just they still have the recordings. There was a few years ago a big project about it. So that's one thing where you can use like previously recorded histories to relate to past events. But I think, as Garrett was saying also about a similar subject, is you can interview people who have oral traditions like in their culture. So that's not exactly getting a first person. Obviously, you can't get a first person, like Jillian can't get a first person event from 200 years ago. Sorry, I don't really know time frames that well. But you can, have these like secondary oral traditions, and then also like history is passed down. So I mean, that would be my 2 cents, Maria. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Marty.
Yeah, like you were saying, Murdy, this is something that I would be explicitly encountering if I wanted to incorporate oral history into my research. You can't necessarily research, the conquistadors. It's not something that you can do. However, there are documents and oral traditions that get passed down or that survive to something that can be interpreted today, or I mean, it's not like people didn't interview each other back in those days either. Not in the same context and not nearly as scientific as maybe we'd like to say today, but there are certainly recorded conversations that have happened. I mean, we have the Magna Carta, that's still an original document that's 800 years old. That's the product of a conversation between different power groups and different parts of the government at the time. So being able to analyze documents and try to articulate the conversation that may have produced them, I think is a possible way to incorporate the oral history aspect, where these past events that you can't interview people for, you can try to present them in the more medium oriented ways we've discussed oral history in, like through podcasts, educational podcasting, or conversations with these experts that can really provide an opinion on the context and how these documents could necessarily have been warranted in the first place, or evidence, whatever it may be, if it's not a document.
Thank you, Garrett. Any other? Go.
Sorry. The last thing I wanted to bring up, and I have tragically forgotten the name of it. I was looking through the modules trying to find it, but what came to my mind immediately were the paintings of the mixed families.
The Casta paintings.
Yes. And so that to me was the primary example of, what kind of story is the painting telling about the people in it? What was their relation to each other? How were they depicted? And that in some ways lends you to a type of oral history that I think is really valuable.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I can relate this to my own research. So with the canoe that I'm studying, that is 650 years old, the tribal members who used that canoe, who I'm also want to learn about their lives, didn't have any form of writing, much like Chai was saying with the Hmong people. So Native Americans in the U.S. didn't have writing until Europeans came over and taught them. So Native Americans had oral histories that were just passed down, and they're still passed down today. So when I do my interviews with the Kohari tribe, we'll talk about those oral histories and traditions as well, and how they are continued. So to try and help and learn about that time period, even though certainly no one from 650 years ago is still alive, but their people and their essence are still alive. So we can learn from that.
Thank you, Lydia. Okay, we have 1 minute left, so I would ask two people to answer the following questions. How do you see the future of oral history going? Do you see a future for oral history?
So I can't necessarily predict the future, but I do wonder a lot about how what we're doing right now is going to affect oral history, as telecommunication has become like the new normal. I know we won't have to use it forever. I mean, hopefully, but I think that there are some benefits to it, which are that you could interview someone halfway across the world without leaving your house or your office. However, I don't think it has as much value as sitting down and interviewing someone. I don't know that you would get as much out of the interviews if you're doing it over a camera on a computer. So that's a short answer, I guess.
Thank you, Avery.
One of my biggest takeaways from this course was StoryCorps. And for those in the audience who are not familiar with this platform, it's an application and it's sort of an online thing, and they also have a YouTube channel, and they encourage individuals across America to do their own interviews and recordings of oral histories, and then they all get collected and saved in the Library of Congress. And so I think it's such a good representation of the future of oral histories, because it's taking advantage of the ways that social media and technology have allowed us to become more connected and have allowed us to sort of have access to all these different resources. And I think it provides a good foundation of what oral histories can be like in the future, especially because StoryCorps it's so beautiful and it's so honest, because it's not this power dynamic of an interviewer and an interviewee. It's just two family members or cousins or something just having a conversation together and reminiscing, and it just captures that sort of pure relationship and conversation in ways that other interviews don't. And so that's a part of the future of oral histories that I find really exciting.
Thank you, Jillian. And we are out of time. So I would like to invite the audience and you for the next Explorers event. It's going to take place May 11, 12, and 13. It's about museums and communal digitas in Latin America. If you are interested, I can give you the information. It's going to be advertised soon. And I want to thank you all for your answers, for your engagement in the class. It was truly a pleasure. And I hope to see you soon. And everybody have a nice summer.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take it easy.